and welcome to Lecture 9 of this interminable series on theology and humor. Again, I want to thank Bob Anderson, who is our producer, for just putting this all together. But today we're going to pick up where we left off from last week, where we looked at the mystery religions and how comedy was a part of that, and also the Feast of Fools. If you remember in the Feast of Fools, the humble could mock the magnificent, the powerful. And so I have had students who have come and mocked me. This is a very appropriate strategy for them to use during a Feast of Fools. Of course, during final exam time, they are not smirking as much as they are the student on the right. But we move next to the more serious business of today, and that's to look at this time of death and pandemic and plague. When the Black Death, the bubonic plague, hit in 1348, we realized laughter did not disappear, but laughter took on a whole new flavor for what we will see during this time. This is kind of a scene from Monty Python, you remember, in the Holy Grail, where they're calling to bring out your dead, and the dead would be piled upon one another. And so it's a very kind of grotesque, macabre image, but it's something that humorists and satirists will take and communicate. Well, the next thing we see is this whole idea of the danse macabre. The danse macabre is really a dance of death. And many of these images were what were known as memento mori, to remember that you are going to die. The way that we see these skeletons, we will one day be like them. And so this became kind of a common theme of remembering your mortality. There would be monks who would even get into coffins and spend the night so they could remember how ephemeral and how fragile life was. And yet, out of this would come comedy. Where we see that next is with this great artist, Hans Holbein. Now, Hans Holbein went down to Basel, Switzerland, which is the home of great humorists and satirists. I was born in Basel, Switzerland. Nevertheless, he went there to publish this great work, The Dance of Death, a whole series of woodblock prints. And he was also influenced by Martin Luther. He had illustrated the translation of the New Testament into German for Luther. And so he began to kind of use this as propaganda, his illustration, his woodcuts. And the first woodcut we're looking at here is when death comes, and death as this skeleton, this memento mori, he comes and he captures this beggar friar, this mendicant friar. The mendicant friar has just filled his bags with money. He's got his box, he's taken the money from the poor, and he thinks he's getting away, but death comes and surprises him. It comes next as well, where we see a young nun who is piously kneeling at the altar, but she is a little distracted by her lover who is playing his lute. Now, his lute becomes a very strong symbol of his own wooing of her. And meanwhile, when they are just flirting and wooing each other, we find death arrives as a hideous old hag. And what is she doing? She is extinguishing the altar candles. Candles, like hourglasses, are symbols of the shortness of time, the brevity of our lives. And so we find Holbein here is just beginning to say, be aware that death can come to you at any time. But my favorite Holbein one is the next one, where we find a preacher in his pulpit. He's very loquacious, he's garrulous, he's talking and talking and talking like other people on PowerPoints. And death sneaks up behind him and is preparing to strike him, ironically, with a jawbone. I suspect he's been preaching too long. But sometimes you may be sitting in church, and if the sermon gets too long, just imagine, memento mori, not only for you, but for the preacher. His time is up. What this brings us to next is Obarski, who is a modern animator and very kind of ironic and surreal with his death fairy tales. And here he is trying to do the same thing that we find in Holbein. What we find that Obarski is doing, he is taking, like me, he's taking his little wand, and he takes his wand and it goes poof, 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 and you are no more. In fact, I haven't seen you yet, so I really wonder if you're there. But I still have my little wand. But we move on from him, and we go next to the idea that the Black Death was really a horrific event that killed from between 1/3 to 1/2 of the population of Western Europe. It came from Canton, China, and came down the Black Sea into Italy and up to some of the major ports like Venice and like Genoa and Marseille, and then spread all over Europe and up to England. And one of the places it hit was Florence. And there was a young man in Florence who experienced this, and his name was Giovanni Boccaccio. And he began to write about 4 or 5 years after this plague had hit his very naughty, bawdy, gaudy, but moral Decameron, 10 days. And what we see in these 10 days is next the fact that he would gather 7 women and 3 men, and they would go out to the countryside. They would escape what they thought was death by going out there, and they told 10 stories a day for 10 days. Thus we get the term Decameron. And they would tell these very pious and holy tales. They would tell tragic tales, but they would also tell very bawdy and erotic tales. It was called, nicknamed, the human comedy, because he looked at the comedy of our lives, of how ironic death can come and surprise us, but also how fickle we are. We see this next in one of the tales, which is very naughty. It is about a sly lady who induces a very stupid friar in her confession. She sets up a rendezvous with a gallant lover who comes to visit her when her husband's away. And she's only able to do this because the friar is so concerned about keeping everything right and perfect that he allows these two to kind of get together. But that's not as bad as the next tale. The next tale is told by Dionio, who tells a story about a monk, Rustico. Rustico is a very desiring, passionate monk, and he instructs a young woman, Alabec, about the passageway to hell in her body. Now, this is getting very naughty. He's saying, there is a way that you can send my red-hot devil back down to hell. You have the passageway. Now, as he teaches her how to send that devil back to hell, she begins to enjoy it a bit too much. And she wears the monk out. And so he has to run away and take his vows of chastity all over again. And she goes to tell the old ladies about what has happened. And they laugh so hard, and they marry her off to a young, hearty stud so that she can send the devil to hell quite a bit. Now, here we find how frisky Boccaccio can be. But he still is going to move us next to the fact that during this time of the plague, hedonism would take over a lot of people, and they would commit fornication and adultery. And there's this warning that even though you think you're above death with your pleasure, you're not. There's going to be a time of reckoning, a time when your vices you will have to repent of. The second author we look at next is a man by the name of William Langley. We don't know much about him, but he created this wonderful story of Piers Plowman, or Peter the Plowman. And it really is about the life of a typical peasant in the 14th century. And as you can see, that he was probably around 18 years old when the plague hit there. But he talks about Peter and Peter's observations about life. And many of them are kind of comic observations. We see next that he begins with the idea that we are all pilgrims. All of us are on a journey to the celestial city. And so Langland creates Will, which is like William, who is the dreamer, and he begins to dream about this pilgrimage. And along the pilgrimage, he's going to meet Peter the Plowman. What we see next is that he dreams in his own journey to find truth and salvation. He finds that English society at this time is a failure. It doesn't live up to the virtues of being a Christian society. And so Piers the Plowman is explaining all of these things to him. And he says one of the main reasons for this is because of the corruption of the church. Its clergy are not living the life they were called to live. And so he begins his indignant satire on the idea that the wealthy laity have so much money. They've stored so much money, but they have not heard the sermons of Jesus when he talks in Matthew 25 about insomuch as you've done it to the least of these, you've done it to me. And so they do not practice charity to the poor. And so he begins to kind of attack this kind of teaching. Now, what we see next is that the laity do not know the Bible. In fact, he has one character who confesses, I cannot perfectly say the Lord's Prayer as the priest sings it, but I do know all the rhymes of Robin Hood. And so they knew the local legends, but they did not know their Pater Noster. They did not know how to say Our Father. And so he's mocking the illiteracy and the ignorance of the laity that is there. Next, we find that he criticized those people who would take pilgrimages to holy places as hypocrites and liars, because instead of taking care of their next door neighbor, instead of taking care of the poor and serving one's own community, they would go off on these holy trips, these pleasure tours, down to the Holy Land or to any other site they thought was wonderful. Now, Langland really functions as a ventriloquist for orthodoxy. He really teaches what the good Christian should be according to Scripture, but he does it in a satiric way. In fact, he looks at friars and he says, they have faces as fat as a full bladder. They are spoiled and glutton and avarice, and when you look at them, you do not see the Christ, but you see them full of self-indulgence. What he did next was satirized all the estates. Now, there were 3 estates at this time. There were those who pray, which were the clergy, those who fight, which were the nobility, and those who work, which were the peasants. The clergy took up about 5% of the population, the nobility about 5%, and so 90% of the people were the peasants. But you find at this time, too, a growing merchant class. And the nobles and the clergy were not really keeping up their part. And so we're going to find later on that Langland's book, Piers the Plowman, is going to be used for the peasants' revolt. They're going to find quotes from him of how they have been not taken care of, and so they have a right to riot. And so it becomes a dangerous text that will lead to the Reformation, as we see come up. But next we find that he still confronts the kind of stupidity and the avarice and the gluttony of these people. In fact, he creates a wonderful character called Hunger. And Hunger begins to attack the peasants. And the peasants realize they are too lazy and slothful themselves, and unless they work, they're going to find themselves without any pizza or any bread, and the devil himself, the skeleton himself, will come and take them away. One of his characters we see next is the character Gluttony. Now, Gluttony is on the way to confession. But along the way, he passes the house of Betty Brewer. And Betty Brewer has this wonderful tavern. And so he takes a detour with a drinking party, and with gusto, he goes straight into the pub. And we read what Langland wrote. He said, there was laughing and loving and please pass the cup. Bargaining and drinking, they kept starting up, and sat so till evensong, and sang from time to time, until Glutton had gobbled down a gallon and a gill. His guts began to rumble like 2 greedy sows. He pissed half a gallon in the time of a Pater Noster. He blew his round bugle at the backbone's bottom, so that all who heard that horn had to hold their noses. So we find that for Langland, he is mocking those who eat too much, and Gluttony, of course, ends up barfing, and then he repents. And he has to join the others in repentance. But buffoons and fools never learn easily. And so here is a picture that Langland presents for all of us to see. He satirized other of the 7 deadly sins. We see next avarice. And avarice, instead of the clergy feeding their sheep and tending their sheep, as Peter, who was a fisherman, was supposed to do, he shows how a greedy, hungry cleric is an old hag with louse-infested hair. In fact, part of the satire is this, that she's even hoarding the lice. She keeps all the lice because she doesn't want to lose anything. and how we hoard things. There are so many useless things that all of us still hoard that we have to get rid of. And when you downsize and want to move somewhere else, you realize how much you have been a hoarder as well. But she's not only content to count the sheep in her own sleep. And here's where the idea that you count sheep in your sleep that Langland gives us. But she goes into other people's dreams and steals their sheep. That characterizes avarice. Now we leave Langland and we go to the man that he influenced next quite a bit. And this was Geoffrey Chaucer, of whom most of you are probably fully aware. He would combine storytelling, great characters, jokes, all with a holy pilgrimage to the tomb of St. Thomas of Becket. Now you remember that Langland attacked those who would go on pilgrimage and not really care for others. But there were those who would go to St. Becket, to Canterbury during the plague years and pray for healing. And so it could be that Geoffrey Chaucer remembers those kinds of people, but he is going to put together what we see next, this whole group who are going to gather, and they're so different. They're from all the estates. I mean, this is one of the most egalitarian and democratic groups you could ever see gather. He gathers nobles, he gathers clergy, and he gathers peasants of all kinds. And they begin at this tavern called the Tabard Inn in Southwark. And they're all going to march and to ride to St. Thomas Becket's martyr's tomb at Canterbury Cathedral. What we see next are these 30 pilgrims that William Blake has kind of etched. And here they're all gathered together. You can imagine that when you have all of these people who are so diverse, there are going to be fights and arguments and affairs and everything else. But all of them are going to tell their stories. The next thing we see that I think is really just very fun, that I always like to do in my books as well, is to impishly insert yourself. And Chaucer does. He puts himself as one of the characters. But when he gives his verse, when he gives his rhyme, the host, whose name is Harry Bailey, abruptly shuts him up and he says, "Thy drasty rhymin' is not worth a turd. This is a bunch of dung that you're speaking. Shut up." And so Chaucer, in a great bit of self-effacing humor, just really mocks his own poetry in here. And I think every good author should do that when you find them having fun with themselves. What we find next, though, is that Chaucer does explore, much like Langland did, next all of these Canterbury tales. And the Canterbury Tales looks at them. There's a fat miller that we're going to be looking at who tells a joke about his arch rival, the Reeve. And he's going to tell a joke about cuckoldry. He's going to tell a joke about religious gullibility. And he's going to talk about this kind of release of bodily air, a fart well placed. Now, we find in this kind of one illustration to the right here, "I will eviscerate you in fiction," he says. And Chaucer did eviscerate certain professions. Next, we find the miller's tale itself. And the miller you see on the right has his bagpipes, but he's a bully. And he is going to tell the tale about a choleric reeve. Now, the reeve is also a carpenter, and a reeve is someone who manages other people's estates. But the reeve is old and skinny, and we will see kind of really ugly. But he's married a very young and pretty wife because he has some money. So this kind of bully, this churlish miller, who is a bit tipsy himself, he opens, he says, "Have you heard this one before? Let me tell you a little bit about how a reeve or a carpenter has been cuckolded." Now, the reeve knows what kind of joke is coming. And so he says, "No, please don't tell this. Tell something less offensive, something more wholesome that we can all enjoy." But to no avail. The miller goes on next to talk about 4 characters. Now, there are 3 stories that he embeds in the miller's tale. The first story is going to be about a flood, where Nicholas, a student, tells John, the carpenter or the reeve, the story about how God is going to send this enormous flood that's going to destroy humankind again. And of course, John is so ignorant about his Bible, he doesn't remember that God promised never to use a flood again and sent the rainbow. But John is persuaded that the flood is going to come. And so he builds 3 tubs on the roof and little barrels that they could all sleep in and then float away when the flood comes. Now, his pretty wife, Allison, is there, and she's attracted to Nicholas, and Nicholas is attracted to her. And so we're going to find that they're going to have a little affair while this goes on. And then there's going to be another kind of clerical student who comes and is also in love with Allison, and is going to lead to our third story. But next, let's go and start at the beginning. This is where John, the old skinflint, rents out his room to this university student, Nicholas. And Nicholas and Allison hatch this plan about the apocalyptic story of the flood. So the Reeve builds the 3 tubs, the carpet on top of the roof, and there are 3 stories up. So it's kind of very clever structure that Chaucer has given us, 3 stories and 3 stories. So John goes up there, he gets in his tub, and he's waiting for the flood, waiting for this apocalypse. And meanwhile, Nicholas and Allison begin their affair. We go next to the beginning of the second story, when a local parish clerk named Absalom, who is infatuated with Allison, comes to her window late at night. It's very dark, and he begs her. He knocks on the window, and he says, "Please, please, give me a kiss." Now, Allison is feeling quite frisky, and so she decides to prank him. She sticks her bum out the window. Absalom is waiting for the kiss. He puckers up, and he kisses her arse, at which she laughs very loudly. And this is one of the best, giddiest laughs ever to be recorded in literature. She goes, "Tee-hee," quote she, and clapped the window shut. And so here, after being kind of smacked on the bun, she is just so tickled and delighted with her own mischief that she laughs, "Tee-hee." It's a wonderful laugh that many of you can laugh during the day, and people will wonder what mischief you're up to. But we go on next to the third story. And this is when Absalom becomes so angry and so incensed that he goes and he gets a red-hot poker. And he returns to wreak vengeance on this woman. But now Nicholas, seeing the delight that Allison had, wants to be part of the prank. So he wants to punk Absalom himself. So he sticks his own arse out the window. Now, in the dark, the parish clerk doesn't know who it is, but he still croons. He says, "Speak, sweet bird, I know not where thou art." At this, Nicholas sticks his bum out, and he lets fly a fart. In other words, he expresses himself with a great applause. But he is immediately burned by the poker on his ass. And he shouts for water to quench the burn. He goes, "Water, water!" And John, up on the 3rd floor, thinks the apocalyptic flood has come. He panics, and he falls all 3 stories to the bottom of the house. And so you see how all of these stories come together. The next image is a quilt by B.J. Eldgren, whose quilts I've shown you before. But in her magic kind of artistic talent, we see all of these things. On the left, you see John sleeping up in his tub. But then you see Allison and Nicholas in their bed. And you see Absalom peeking in the window. And down below is where he'll get his red-hot poker with his heart that had been broken. One of the fun things, of course, though, that B.J. Eldgren does is she puts her own dog, the black and white collie there, in every kind of quilt that she makes. But I just wanted to kind of share that kind of really delight with you. We move on next to another Chaucer tale, which is the Pardoner's Tale. Now, the Pardoner is one of the worst characters and most hypocritical characters in Chaucer's Canterbury Tale. He has long, greasy yellow hair. He doesn't wash it, but he's proud of it. He has no body hair, and he has these bulging eyeballs. In the prologue, will talk about all the tricks that he kind of pulls on people. Now, he's the one who sells indulgences to keep people from purgatory or to shorten your time. He also kind of sells phony relics. And so he takes advantage. He's one of the worst Catholics that we're going to see that Martin Luther is going to kind of respond to. And he keeps all the money. He pockets it himself. And he is going to go to hell himself unless he repents. But he's probably not going to do that. But what we see next is his tale about a cautionary sermon about 3 dissolute young men. Now, these men are hanging around a tavern, and they're drinking, and they're sinning, and all of a sudden they hear that death has killed one of their friends. Again, you see this reference to the plague, that the plague is in the backdrop of many of these tales. So they hear about their friend's death, and they set out, because they're so drunk, to find death, think of the bubonic plague, and they want to kill him. So they go different places and they meet this mysterious old man. And he rudely demands that he tell them where death is. He tells them to follow a crooked path. Now remember, in Scripture, there is the narrow way, which is straight, or there is the broad way, the crooked way that leads to destruction. And so they follow this crooked path, and they were going to find death under a tree. But what we find next is that when they find the tree, there's actually gold under there. And so they forget all about death, and in their greed, they want to celebrate. So they send the youngest of the three off to town to purchase drink. Now he buys the drink, but he also buys some strong rat poison. And you remember, the cause of the plague were the fleas on the rats that began to kind of spread throughout Europe. And so we find this other kind of allusion to what is going on to death. The rat poison is there. And unfortunately, they didn't have enough rat poison during the plague. But he buys this rat poison from an apothecary, and he puts it into 2 bottles of wine. So he takes his wine back and he returns. But what he doesn't know is that his 2 friends had plotted to kill him. And as soon as he returns, they kill him so they could share the money. And then they take the wine and drink it. But it is poison. And they finally find death, all 3 of them. What we find next, however, is that J.K. Rowling, in her Harry Potter series, recreates the partner's tale of the tale of the 3 brothers. That death will come to those who are greedy. The third story that we're looking at is about Hubert, the friar. The friar is very similar to the partner, but the friar is licensed to beg for money. He's a mendicant monk, but he also seduces young women, and he uses all of the money from his collections to pay off his own sins. He thinks that though a widow might be shoeless, he can still persuade her to give him money. The more money he gets a sinner to pay, the easier the penance he's given by the friar. So the friar sells indulgences. He sells forgiveness for any manner of sin. And such unsavory practices enable him to wear brand spanking new expensive robes and shoes, sandals, and anything. And so instead of taking care of the poor and the sick, he hangs out and dallies with the wealthy landowners, the barmaids, the noblemen, and the tavern owners. But he has one problem, and that is his enemy. He hates another fraud, the summoner. And so the friar and the summoner are going to be fighting one another, and they're going to tell stories about one another. Now, the story we see next is that the friar tells a story of a summoner, again his nemesis, who meets a devil on the road. And the summoner and the devil get along really well. They say, we're friends. We're kind of in the same business. We're going to go to hell together. So let's share whatever we can give them. So they say, yes. And they go down the road and they find a man who's frustrated with his horses. And the man frustrated just kind of mutters, well, the devil take my horses. And the summoner says, hey, let's take the man. And the devil says, no, we really can't take him because there was no real intent that we take them. It's just one of his exclamations. He's just frustrated. So we can't do anything there. But where's there's intent, we can take that person to hell. So the summoner says, now watch me. I'm going to boast how I can cheat a widow out of her money by falsely accusing her of adultery. So he goes and he meets her and he tries to extort her, demands money, and then he sees a frying pan. I want the frying pan too. But instead, this woman is a very smart lady. And what she does instead is she damns him to hell. And the demon says, hey, she has intent. Her intent is true. So the devil takes the summoner and the frying pan with him to hell. Next, we see the summoner will come back with his own story. His story is about, in fact, look at him first. I mean, he is this kind of legal bully who threatens to take innocent people to court. He takes bribes from the guilty, and he's very pimply faced. He has garlic breath. He's just as repellent as the friar and as the partner. These people are not the people you want to travel with, but Chaucer still brings them along. Now he's going to tell a story about a friar. The friar told a summoner story, and now he's going to tell a friar story. And the friar goes to visit a sick beneficiary of his, a man called Thomas. He's a generous benefactor. And the friar hopes to squeeze another gift from Thomas before he dies. But Thomas has become a little wary of this friar, and he realizes the mercenary motives of this religious figure. And so before bestowing the gift, Thomas makes the friar promise that whatever gift he gives him, he will divide it equally among all the friars. However, the friar receives something quite intangible and very unpleasant. What we see next is that the friar agrees that what he has given him, and Thomas says, retrieve the gift from under my rear end. And so the friar reaches down, he puts his hand in the backside, and Thomas unleashes a monstrous fart into the friar's hand. So how do you take this intangible gift and share it? So what the friar does next, he goes to the lord of the village and explains the problem. And the Lord Squire says, I've got a solution for how to divide a fart evenly. Place each of your brother friars around a wheel, each at the end of one of the 12 spokes, and then allow the fart to be released at the center of the wheel, and the smell will then travel evenly along each spoke to the nose of each friar. And so he's able to do this and share it. But it's not over for the friar yet, because the friar is taken down to hell much like the summoner was. And when he gets into hell, he doesn't see any friars. There are no fellows there. So he thinks that all my fellow friars must be holy. But the angel delivering him orders Satan, and he says to Satan, hold up thy tail, thou Satanist, quoth he, show forth thy arse, and let the friar see where is the nest of friars in this place. And with that, the friars fly out of Satan's ass, swarm around the room, and then disappear back up his ass. So you can see that these two holy monks really play off each other and send each other to hell. Next to the last story we go to is the wife of Bath. Now, the wife of Bath is one of my favorite characters. She is a hardy widow. She has already sent 5 husbands to Jesus. And they were all good marriages, she says, because she dominated each of her husbands. The last one she almost didn't because she really was in love with him. But all the others she was sovereign over, and she received all of their inheritance. So she is a very wealthy and hardy woman, and very smart. Now what we see next is that this gap-toothed wife defends the institution of marriage with earthly wit, very earthy wit. She asks, why did God make such members of generation, in other words, those unseemly tools that are given for procreation, what helps us to make children, those unseemly members, such as her belle chose, her lovely thing, and a man's silly instrument, his poor little silly thing. And when she asked, why did God make these 2 instruments of procreation, she answers next. She knows that God didn't invent such human organs just to distinguish men from women, or just to give us a way to purge urine. She says, no, my experience has taught her otherwise, that there is a blessed reason God has given us these unseemly members. And thank God for that. But next we get to her story. And her story begins horrifically with assault and rape. She tells the story of a knight who has assaulted a young woman. And he is brought before Queen Guinevere and the whole crowd and congregation of ladies. And as they are there, they are ready to execute him and take his head off, to behead him, because he has done this to a woman. And Queen Guinevere, as he begs for his life, Queen Guinevere finally says, okay, I will give you one chance. I will give you 1 year to find out what it is that women want. If you can find out what women want by the end of the year, I will spare your life. And so he goes out on this quest, and he interviews so many women. They tell him so many things. He goes to so many wise sages. and they tell him things, but nothing seems to resonate. And finally, it is the day before he is to go back to the court and answer to Queen Guinevere. And as he does, he finds this old hag, this ugly old woman who is pockmarked and disastrous looking. And she says, if you promise to do what I ask, I will tell you what women want. And the knight is exhausted, he's desperate, and he says, please, I will do whatever you want. Just tell me what women want. And so she whispers in his ear. And the next thing we see, that he goes before Guinevere. And Guinevere says, what is it that women want? And he looks around and he says, women want to be sovereign over their lords. And the women look around and they go, that makes sense. That is good. That is the right answer. And he breathes this kind of just gasp of relief. But then this ugly little old woman comes up to him again. And she says, now, I want you to marry me. And he thinks, you know, death might not have been too bad. But he says, okay, I did make my promise. And he says, I don't know. This was really just a hard choice. I'm between a rock and a hard place. What am I going to choose? And she says, well, I'll give you another choice. Do you want me beautiful and faithless? Or do you want me ugly and old and faithful? She says, you may choose one of them, and I will be that kind of wife to you. And so what he says and what he answers shows the wisdom of his journey. He says, whatever you wish, your will is sovereign. And she says, because you have chosen wisely, I will be both beautiful and faithful to you. It's a wonderful story of how we men have to learn to submit our will. It is not my will be done, but thy will be done, my wife. I hope she's not listening. Next, we see that this has been made into a movie with Helen Hunt and Mel Gibson. And so this whole story of what women want, can we really kind of read what they want? And there's a little twist on that that doesn't really follow Chaucer, but it's still quite a delight. The last story that we bring out of Chaucer is the Nun's Priest Tale. And this is about Chanticleer, or the rooster. And remember last week we talked about how the rooster is like a preacher. He gets up early at dawn, he gets up and he crows loudly from his perch. He takes all the best grain and he lays the hens. And so Chanticleer, this rooster, is one of those kind of great preachers that is there, and so proud of his voice that a fox comes up, and a fox kind of deceives him and flatters him and says, why don't you kind of crow loudly like you do? Because your voice is so eloquent. It's so melodious. And so the pride of the cock begins to kind of crow. And by then, the fox grabs him by the neck and he runs off with him. And the hunters and everyone chase the fox who has the crow in his mouth. But the realizing that the cock is going to die, he looks at the fox and he says, why don't you look back and kind of mock the hunters for the fact that you captured me and they can't capture you? And so out of the pride of the fox, he shouts out back to them, look what I've done. But as soon as he did, of course, the rooster comes out of his mouth and flies up to a tree and is safe. That gets us next to what we see as Chaucer's zoomorphic satire, kind of the structure using animals, this beastly tale to tell us something. And this is occurring on the eve of Reformation, remember that. So it's going to sound like some of Luther's protest. But he says there needs to be a muzzling of wayward priests and preachers. For the lesson to the rooster is, keep your eyes open, don't be stupid. But the moral for the fox is, keep your mouth shut. Now this is very much like the next kind of thing. First we'll look at B.J. Elvgren again, has created this wonderful kind of quilt of the Nun's Priest Tale, of Chanticleer who is there coming down and capturing, the fox captures the rooster, and we see B.J. and her dog down in the far right corner. It's just a kind of a wonderful moment of this great tale. Next we get to another bestiary, which is a beast tale done in early 13th century called The Owl and the Nightingale. And animals were used to teach people. And here we have two female birds. So think of those two female birds that you are with. Every woman and every man is probably a bird. And so you get to decide what kind of bird you want to be. You can be an owl or you can be a nightingale. Now, these two contentious female birds begin to debate, and they debate and trade insults. It's about age and wisdom, look how I have, or this kind of whippersnapper youth and love and energy. And they trade insults. It's what is called an avian mudslinging, back and forth. Who's the better bird, they argue. And whether religion should be, as the owl would say, for repentance and weeping, or as the nightingale would say, for celebration and joy. And they talk about the nature of women and what's a good marriage. And next we find that they begin to kind of complain and attack each other personally. The nightingale says, your song, owl, is gloomy. Well, mine is full of joy and beauty. And the owl gets really frustrated and furious. He's explained as being swollen like she had swallowed a frog. And she retorts that the nightingales only have one talent. They can sing in summer. And that's the season of lechery, when all of the gay melodies of the nightingale tempt women to act promiscuously. While the owl helps the church, because I get rid of rats. So here we have again this kind of idea of the plague maybe. Oh no, responds the nightingale, for my music reminds the congregation of the glories of heaven. The owl scowls that people first need to repent of their sins. Mournful music is much better. The old hymns. No, says the nightingale, we must sing happy tunes. But the owl has kind of one of the last lines. He says, nightingales live in hedges where men thrust out their behinds and go to the bathroom. So look what you are like. But next we find there are two songs, and let me just go through them. The owl sings, and by my song I teach all men they'd better turn their backs on sin, and warn them against evil ways, lest they be fooled for all their days. For better weep a while before than burn in hell forevermore. So you can see the ominous hymn of the owl. And the nightingale warbles, and helped by me, however meagerly, they sing out all their hymns more eagerly. Thus I warn them for their good to contemplate in a joyful mood, and bid them to seek earnestly the hymn that rings eternally. The two of them sing so well. But it's this debate. Now this debate we can see next when we go up to Scotland. And up in Scotland, there's this wonderful, very fierce poet, William Dunbar. William Dunbar, you may want to know one of his earlier lines. He says, please thy maker and be merry, and give not for this world a cherry. He sounds like the nightingale. He wrote a dance of the seven deadly sins, kind of this comic view of all this kind of deadly sins in hell and what they're like. But what he's most known for is this whole art of flighting. It's a very farcical art, but flighting is the fine art of savage insult, where people would mock each other. And where we see next is this kind of medieval insult is like a verbal jousting. It's very outrageous. It's where you invent phrases and you show your dexterity in being abusive and attacking and assassinating the character of your foe. There's a lot of scatology, there's heresy, there's theft, scolding, there's contentious quarreling, there's this formalized exchange of taunts and ridicule, dueling in alliteration, in short, a church vestry meeting. It's where these things happen, where it's useless, or a university meeting more likely. Next, however, we find this wonderful image of famous Scots. And if you look on the left side, you can see Dunbar. He's back there, this monk with his tonsure, and he's standing fairly close to James IV in this court. And over on the far right is his nemesis, is his adversary, who is Walter Kennedy. And these are going to be the two great poets, bards or mockers. They're the ones who are going to take each other. And we see next in this kind of battle of flighting, this pyrotechnic display of verbal mocking. So Dunbar and Kennedy, they're engaged in this jousting, accusing each other of things like being a dwarf descended from Beelzebub. You're kind of a small version of the devil. Or you have intercourse with mares, or you can't control your bowel movements. And so this is very similar to that fine art of savage insults that you find in New York City taxi drivers. It's just this kind of loud, brash kind of arrogance that is there, where it is taken seriously. You go next to the kind of one of the low points is that Kennedy looks at Dunbar and says, I'll bet that your kind of lowland backside can produce a finer and more polished word, Smith, than anything a village that comes out of your lips. In other words, your rear end is more articulate than your mouth. And Kennedy calls Dunbar a shit but wit, who likes to show shit by the cartload. This is one of the earliest uses of that word. So please excuse me, I'm using Old English. But then he goes into this ferocious alliteration, using all kinds of categories of abuse. Now you may recognize this that we get to next, which is today known as kind of a rap version of the dozens. There's this kind of ritual exchange of poetic insults. Long before there were rap battles, there was flighting, this exchange of witty, insulting verses, where these two characters would get together, and many of them were kind of, yo mama, is this or that. And so these kind of verbal throwdowns go back to the time of Dunbar and Kennedy. The next thing we find, even your mama is so fat, she on both sides of the family. Or even President Obama would use it when he talks about the White House press corps is here. I know CNN has taken some knocks lately, but the fact is I admire their commitment to cover all sides of the story, just in case one of them happens to be accurate. So this kind of mocking comes from flighting, this wonderful kind of art of savage insult. Now, lastly, and next we move to the works of Rabelais, and we're going to end with this great giant of a writer. He was a Franciscan friar. He was a doctor, he was a traveler. He was a true Christian humanist. He was a Benedictine monk, an alchemist, a teacher. He was a leader of the French Renaissance, but he was also considered a heretic by some. He was a Greek scholar, but he was greatly known as being a satirical writer of the life of Gargantua and Pantagruel, his two giants. And they are kind of humorous adventures, and it's one of the greatest reads of all time. Now, Gargantua and his son Pantagruel is in this kind of very scatological, body, kind of carnival-like book. But there is a very serious examination of society, of politics, of education, and particularly of religion. And so you see theology and humor coming together in a really robust, kind of earthy way. The next thing we see is that this monk had left his cloister to study law. But after studying law, he repented, like all good lawyers should. And then he went into medicine during the plague. Now, this giant jester would play before God. He'd play before the King of Kings. And he mocks all the little hypocrites of whom he saw himself as one. And he would come into the court almost belching and farting in ways that would draw your attention and make you laugh. Morally, he said he was like a medieval doctor studying the stools of society. You look at the excrement, and he applies enema wherever he thought necessary. But you could tell the nature of a person's disease by looking at their stool. What that leads us to next is that his preface. And in his preface, he writes, "Good friends, my readers, who peruse this book, don't be offended while on it you look. Denude yourself, rid yourself of all depraved affection, for it doesn't contain any badness nor infection. 'Tis true that it brings forth to you no birth of any value, except in point of mirth. Thinking, therefore, how sorrow might your mind consume, I could no better subject find. 1 inch of joy surmounts of grief a span, because to laugh is proper to the man." He says God has made humans to laugh, and it is a gift. Now, he starts off, as you see on this kind of right picture over there, that we find Gargantua when he's born. He's this huge baby, comes out, his head's so large that for his milk, he needs at least 17,913 cows for a daily kind of intake of milk. But next, after Gargantua, Rabelais publishes Pantagruel. And Pantagruel means all thirst, which means he is seeking the divine bottle. He is a really good Episcopalian. He will go to whatever pub and worship that he finds there. Now, his books are going to be banned by the Sorbonne, this kind of great educational Roman Catholic institution, because he derides certain Roman Catholic practices, and he takes liberties, especially against the academics. This is what my students did to me at the beginning of the lecture, and it's something to be encouraged like that. So he says, for example, he makes fun of how the scholastics teach with all these ways to do something, and he overanalyzes everything. He says, okay, let me explain to you how it's best to wipe your bottom. He says you can wipe it with napkins, or with a tablecloth, or pillows, a lady's neckerchief, a bonnet with feathers, or a cat. He says, no, not a cat. A cat scratched up my bottom a little too much, so let's not do a cat. But he says the best is a well-downed goose. It's so soft and feathery. And so for a time in the quarantine when nobody could find toilet paper, it's good to go back to Rabelais and read what he recommends. So he had all of this kind of vulgar, extravagant merry tales that we find in these two giants. Next, we find that he dissects society in different ways. And his sharpest criticism goes to the fanatics, to the zealots on both sides. He looks at the Popomaniacs. The Popomaniacs are those who idealize and worship the Pope. They put the Pope on a pedestal above Christ. Or what he calls the Pope figs, those who mock the Pope, those who do not take the Pope and the Father of the Church seriously. And so he gets both of them. He says, I really see that the Pope has kind of developed great occult powers. If you look at him, he can draw immense quantities of gold from France to Rome without lifting a finger. In other words, he collects indulgences. So he pokes the Pope. He pokes the holy man, and he says, I find nothing that I can't poke at. Everything is fair game. Now, next we find that Gargantua suffers through an inadequate education. He goes to an Ivy League school. He goes to the University of Paris, which is one of the best. And so what Rabelais does, he really recommends some good educational form. His journey, however, to the university ends with Pantagruel producing a very large bowel movement, which symbolizes much of what Paris or Rome or Washington, D.C. actually produces. And we find Gustave Doré's illustrations kind of capturing kind of the lack of a good education. In fact, next we go that when he goes to Notre Dame, all these people come up to gawk at him because he's so large. He goes, okay, I'm going to give you something to gawk at. And he pulls down his pants, he whips out his willy, and he pisses on them to the point where 260,418 men drowned. That didn't count the women and children. But the survivors were so amazed that the town had been flooded by his urine that in a joke, they renamed the town from Lutetia to Paris. Paris means for a laugh, for a joke. So Paris basically comes back to a gargantuan joke, that it basically is all about urine. So the people of Paris marvel at Gargantua, so now the terms like Gargantua and Rabelais are really associated with eating and drinking too much, with rude, coarse jokes, with sophomores in the first or second year of college, and with earthly pleasures. I want to go next to kind of an image done by John Loyne, my friend, the 90-year-old cartoonist, who basically, for a book called A Mirror for Fools, he illustrated all of these kind of religious satirists that are there. And here he has enough Pantagruel. I'm laughing, when the urine kind of falls down and floods Paris. Next we go, though, how Rabelais says the whole world tries to ignore monks, good monks, because good monks eat the shit of the world. That is, its sins. So shit becomes an apt metaphor for the wickedness that comes out of a man. And it's wonderful that every morning with a good bowel movement, a good constitution, that you are able to get rid of your sin. It's a way to confess who you are and what is inside of you. It's not what goes into a man, but what comes out of a man. And so here we are able, like Rabelais, to say, God, cleanse me every day. Friar John, who is a friend of Gargantua and Pantagruel, is a good monk. But he is like a monk in that old joke where the Jesuit has gone to his superior and he says, can I drink while I'm praying? And the superior says, of course not. You can't drink while you're praying. And the Jesuit responds, well, can I pray while I'm drinking? And the kind of casuistry that we find Jesuits practicing, he gets away with doing both at once. Now, next we find that Rabelais satirizing all of these vices, from simony, which is basically selling church offices, making money off of your religious place, to sodomy, from gluttony to greed. Rabelais instructs people of how to kind of handle all these sins. For example, on carnal lust, Pantagruel tells his friend Panurge, he says there are 5 ways to handle lust. First, you can drink a lot of wine. Second, you can take anti-aphrodisiac drugs. You can take things that are going to quell your lust, your carnal lust. Third, you can study. If you study a lot, you'll find that you don't have time for lust. Fourth, hard work. Hard work kind of drains your energy and exercises you that you don't think about it. And lastly, copulation. Aha, exclaims Panurge. That's what I was waiting for. Give numbers 1 to 4 to anybody else, but for me, give me 5. I'm going to copulate and copulate and copulate and not struggle with lust. Next we go, kind of almost in conclusion. For many of you may remember the Music Man. And in the Music Man, the ladies of River City complain to Professor, the con man Harold Hill, that Marian the librarian advocates reading dirty books. And you remember the 3 dirty books: Chaucer, Rabelais, and Balzac. Chaucer, Rabelais, and Balzac. And later on, however, because of Harold Hill, these same little ladies confessed to Marian, the professor told us to read those books, and we simply adored them all. So that leads us from Rabelais to next, the preview for next week. Medieval satire did a dance, even if it were a dance macabre. And people laughed from the easy chair of Rabelais to recognize that their bodies were to make fools of us all. However, with religious immorality and corruption mushrooming, the Reformation would transform this dance, this delight that we see in Rabelais, into a protest march. Humor itself is going to change from being something you just enjoy to becoming part of a protest, a Protestant protest. The ship of fools would become a battleship for fools. Laughter would be trumped for moral and theological purpose. So next week, we're going to get to the 7 deadly sins and a Reformation, where Luther and Sir Thomas More still use some vulgar language, but they have much more of a theological purpose. We'll see you then.